for this opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. The way that it's going to work is first, we will have Francis Bradley, and if you don't know who Francis is, I don't think I need to introduce him to you. You probably stumbled into the wrong room if you don't know who Francis is. But if you close your eyes and imagine yourself walking your dog at night, you'd be like, that's the guy from Flux Capacitor! And so you'll recognize his voice. You have him in the flesh here. As Chana mentioned, we're also joined by Tom Chapman. So on your tables, you have the new Always On report. In addition to being able to dive into some of the aspects of the Always On report, which Francis will present to you, Tom said he is happy to dive into one of the elements that are presented in there for exploring ways to bring in reliability, and that's looking at opportunities for regional coordination. So he's excited to think about what that could mean where we haven't seen a ton of that yet in Canada, and also talking about communicating reliability to customers and the levels, the different tools that we have for increasing transparency there. We're also joined by Brandon Ott, who you will remember is the leading author of last year's report, Back to Bondbright. Again, we'll get a bit of an overview from Francis on this, but when I asked Brandon, what would you like people to ask you about? What are you excited to kind of dive into a little bit more this year? He said, you know, let's look at some of these benefit cost assessments and alternatives to the benefit cost assessments that we've seen used traditionally when we're trying to figure out how we can optimize around this trilemma of affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And I get to be the rep, I guess, for the federal government, so you don't ask me anything. So please, Francis.
We'll see about that last point once we've got you on the stage. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take the clicker with me. All right. Thank you for the opportunity to give you a quick rundown in terms of what you'll find in the report. So, you know, reliability is changing. There is no doubt about that. You know, rapid grid expansion, the increased threat of extreme weather, and the introduction of new technologies are all changing the way we must understand reliability. Canadian utilities are at the forefront of this transition. So our collective success in achieving net zero and a clean energy economy will in large part hinge on the success of Canadian utilities in maintaining reliability while navigating unprecedented change. Recently, the issue of sustainability has become really the core consideration of policymakers. But this is only one part of what, you know, has been referred to already as that energy trilemma. Reliability and affordability are the other aspects. So, as we look ahead, reliability, in our view, must be prioritized. So, our 2024 report, Electricity in Canada, Always On, makes the case for the importance of reprioritizing reliability as the central consideration of planning our energy future. So the report's recommendations really have three themes, and I'll walk through them. You know, the focus on reliability, number one. Number two, regulatory reform. Number three, fairness and affordability. And these themes take a holistic approach to understanding reliability within the sector. So I will start off with that first theme, the theme of the focus on reliability. And so under that theme, you'll find the following recommendations. So greater coordination between utilities, policymakers, and regulators to set a strategic direction that optimizes the utility business model. So, you know, the utility business model is the sum of multiple components: system and customer needs, regulatory frameworks, policy agendas at the federal and the provincial levels, and partnerships with industry, Indigenous, and local communities. However, we've seen misalignments between the reliability needs of utilities with the available regulatory tools and the broader pressures brought by government and consumers. We need a much greater degree of coordination between the factors and stakeholders that comprise the utility business model. Second, enhanced industry engagement for policy planning and implementation is required, and opportunities to engage in greater regional planning should be pursued. So, Early and active industry engagement in policy development orients policy and planning goals towards achievable targets and reduces inefficient regulatory burden. Regional variability within the sector creates unique reliability concerns that cannot be addressed by a blanket policy approach. And recent reliability events, even here in Western Canada, should be considered a glimpse into the future for every Canadian utility. The lessons from these events are clear. Policy and reliability must be aligned, or there will be undesirable consequences. And then the third, provincial regulators must be enabled with a broader mandate to support decarbonization and electrification objectives while ensuring resource adequacy. So the evolving resource mix places heightened importance on long-term adequacy. We need to meet energy needs across all hours, not just at peak times. To determine full resource adequacy needs, new assessments will be required to ensure that all potential grid disturbances are captured. The broader goals of electrification and decarbonization and additional investments to maintain reliability are still absent from most regulators' mandates. And the mandates of regulators must support the utilities in achieving these policy goals and not create further burdens which undermine the effective allocation of resources. Our second theme on regulatory reform. So the first recommendation here is to develop more flexible financing mechanisms that allow utilities to seek approval for and recover prudently incurred net zero transition costs. So clean energy investments often require incremental reliability investments beyond the like-for-like replacement capacity costs. Thus, we need flexible application periods for utilities to manage evolving trends in supply and demand. We believe that a greater focus on forward-looking multi-year revenue plans with profit and loss sharing mechanisms would provide utilities with greater ability to manage the considerable risks associated with investing to meet an uncertain future and uncertain needs. Second, provide clear regulatory guidance for those utilities seeking to invest in grid modernization and to develop distributed system operator capability. A long-term goal of net zero will require distribution operators to operate the local grid in new ways to maximize the efficient use of assets and reduce costs to consumers. Some regulators have made progress initiating reports and studies, providing guidance on some aspects of grid modernization, but clear guidance needs to be considered by all regulators across Canada as an essential part of grid expansion and modernization. Third recommendation, proactively mitigate extreme weather risk by facilitating grid hardening investments based on long-term future projections rather than historical events. Grid reliability needs are changing in response to more frequent, more intense extreme weather events. Changing weather patterns and the frequency and intensity of events are difficult to predict and not well captured by deterministic planning models. So to ensure utilities are properly supported in these investments, to ensure they're properly supported in these, investment regulations should be flexible and consider how long-term impacts can change historic cost-benefit assessments. And our third theme in the report, fairness and affordability. The first recommendation in this theme, governments at all levels should establish Indigenous loan guarantees to facilitate partnership opportunities. The federal government has recently committed $5 billion to do just this. But these loans should also acknowledge the importance of favoring long-lasting returns on investment. To attract investment to the sector, investors must know that they will receive stable and tangible returns. Second, national policies are needed to address critical supply chain and workforce risks. A secure transition to clean energy hinges on resilient and diversified clean energy technology supply chains. Canada urgently needs a national strategy to proactively manage electrical infrastructure supply chains to ensure Canadian utilities have access to the equipment they need to implement projects on time. And then third, targeted funding is needed to address utility capital constraints, facilitate investments in infrastructure, and support the most impacted provincial economies. The current financing frameworks, which focuses on incenting efficiency and maximizing asset utilization, have recently had an impact on utilities' access to capital for long-term reliability investments. Targeted public funding can bridge this gap in capital. Governments can create a funding environment that incentivizes forward-thinking investments that can react to the changing demands. Now, looking back at last year's report, back to Bondbright, we can develop a more robust image of the approach that needs to be taken to ensure a reliable, affordable, and sustainable grid. Bondbright's work has survived the test of time because the principles outlined are universal. The establishment of a revenue requirement, the fair apportionment of costs among customers, and optimal efficiency through rate design. And just as a reminder of some of our recommendations last year in the report, we need to establish flexible regulatory frameworks which allow for proactive submission of utility investments or service proposals not bound by prescriptive timing requirements. We need enhanced incentive opportunities. They should be available based on demonstrated performance, balancing the potential for additional earnings with appropriate risk sharing. And we need to enable utilities and regulators to leverage alternative benefit cost assessments to assess non-traditional utility investments. So finally, I hope this snapshot of the situation in Canada will encourage you to read this report. You have an executive summary of the Always On report today, and in your program, there is a QR code that will take you to the full version. This report and last year's report, Back to Bondbright, are part of a growing knowledge base that helps us better understand our challenges and the messages to overcome this. These reports form the basis of our discussion today and in today's session, but also many of the conversations we'll have after this forum concludes. And as I said at the beginning, reliability is changing. It's important that we understand these changes and that we develop the tools to overcome the associated challenges. And with that, I'll hand it back to our moderator.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, I definitely think it's worth reflecting back on the two reports that we've had before us over these last 2 years. So I think it's going to be fun to be able to explore how while a lot of these definitions are changing, there are some principles that remain firm, so that it's not an environment that's completely in flux. So I'm going to ask a question first, and then what I'll do is turn it over to you, the audience, so you can start thinking of questions that you want to prepare in your minds. There are 2 mics here, one there and one there, and you can ask questions IRL at this session. I heard during Camput it was all online, but you get to do it in person. So you can start thinking about what you would like to ask Francis or the authors here. But to start this off, we'll begin just addressing the point that was made at the outset, that in a lot of the discussion around the policy trying to introduce sustainability and climate into the future of planning for electricity and energy system reliability writ large in this country has spent a lot of time talking about introducing those new concepts, and not as much ink has been spilt on what remain the consistent pillars, talking about affordability and reliability. But because of that, it can seem like there's been this distorted attention. I would note, not quite captured in the report, but it came out in February 16. There are specific flexibilities to the Canada Energy Regulation, which have been announced, particularly as they relate to the use of natural gas assets. So those have been published. The emission standard smoothing which allows for use of natural gas if carbon capture and storage is going to be added to the plant within 7 years. There's also this opportunity for emergency circumstances, so an ISO of the region or the grid operator can write to the minister and say, we are under an emergency situation right now, they've defined this, and then you are allowed to use backup fossil fuel assets for that period. And similarly, there's an opportunity to aggregate or pool across a number of assets and average out your emissions to be able to stay within the 30 tons per gigawatt hour threshold. And then the use of offsets is also available if you wanted to look at specifically the role of natural gas in ensuring reliability for the system. But as Francis mentioned, and as we heard from the EY presentation, the definition of reliability is changing even so. So this is where I wanted to start with you, Tom, talking about how reliability as utilities are really digging into it, as regulators are digging into it. It's increasingly becoming the primary focus for utilities. And so as we move for greater electrification and a more dynamic and distributed grid, what sorts of techniques or strategies or standards are you seeing which can kind of bring back into focus reliability amongst these other priorities?
Thanks, Jen, and a pleasure to be here and to be on a panel with my colleagues. I think my first response is that reliability has always been like the primary priority for utilities ever since the get-go, knowing that their customers value reliability above everything else, and everything they should do should be driven towards increased reliability. I think we need to recognize, I think we in this room and policymakers and regulators need to recognize that what's before us isn't just, changing out supply assets from fossil units to something else. I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg. How these new assets participate on the system is fundamentally different from how many of the conventional generators have participated on the system over the years. And that introduces all sorts of new ways that reliability will need to be managed. And what I found, having talked to many of the Electricity Canada's membership, is that they're left with almost an impossible situation. Not everybody, but many of the members are left with an increasingly impossible situation where they have to prioritize investments in upgrading existing infrastructure, replacing aging assets for reliability, but they're also under the expectation that they will be making big investments in these new technologies that operate in very different ways and pose new set of reliability challenges. And so they're having to, with limited resources, because the framework within which they operate has, over the last decades, has been primarily focused on efficiencies and productivity improvement, not about wholesale grid expansion, which is what a lot of the policy is driving at. They're left in this very difficult situation. Do they prioritize reliability associated with the existing infrastructure, or should they prioritize reliability associated with distributed generation, intermittent wind and solar generation, even some of the nuclear assets that might be less flexible than conventional sources of power? So they're in a very difficult spot, and the reliability challenge is changing, as I think Francis alluded, and read about it in the report. Typically we've been focused about meeting demand during the peak times, the summer peaks, the winter peaks. But now we're experiencing reliability events throughout the year, and we need to be planning to ensure that we can meet those needs seamlessly and reliably when we least expect them. They might be happening as I know in my background in Ontario, we've had some very strange peaks on Sundays, the first couple of weeks of December. Late May or into September. These are not the times when you would typically expect to have reliability events. And the utilities and the industry must meet those events using a very different set of resources with different characteristics, different operating profiles. And that's changing how the industry needs to manage those assets to meet that changing reliability definition. So maybe I'll just stop there, and Brandon.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of agreement to offer, and I was really thrilled to see that this was the subject of this year's report, and quite enjoyed reading it. There's a lot of good content in there. I encourage folks to read it cover to cover. I mean, for me, it's kind of a good news, bad news story with respect to reliability. Very much agree with Tom. Like, utilities haven't forgotten about reliability, not for a day. And I would certainly not level the accusation that commissioners and board members have forgotten about it either. They all have legislated mandates which will drive them towards that. I'm not sure if they would all say safe and reliable in the legislation, but certainly it's not forgotten. However, reliability is often a downside game. And so the good news is reliability for most utilities has been pretty good. And where it has been not good, the regulators, at least insofar as I've seen, have been quite responsive to utility proposals and investment needs to improve that reliability and ensure that customers are receiving safe and reliable service. The challenge is that creates a situation where reliability, safe and reliable service can start to sort of fade into the background a little bit when we're talking about all of these new and innovative investments that are required to facilitate the energy transition. And when that collides with the energy transition that, as Tom's report outlines very, very well, brings about new dynamics in terms of reliability, new risks and challenges in terms of reliability, you kind of have to take a moment and throw reliability back into the spotlight for a minute and say, well, it's actually not the set of practices that we're used to in years prior, and it's not something that we can leave on autopilot any longer if we're going to make these kinds of investments moving forward that are going to change the way the grid works. And the only other thought I had on this was I've really loved that expression, all regulation is incentive regulation. No matter what the construct you're operating under, if it's a multi-year PBR or if it's a single or multi-year cost of service or any variation in between, there is embedded within that a set of incentives that are pushing the utility one way or the other on a variety of fronts. And with respect to reliability, I question whether now is the opportunity and the time to use incentives to bring it further up the pile of priorities for the utility. Because if it is just a downside game, if it is just a matter of, in the jurisdiction I'm most active in Ontario, minimum service quality requirements, you can certainly expect there's going to be a robust discussion if a utility falls below those reliability requirements. But what if there's a future set of investments, technology changes, whether that be on the supply side or on the demand side, that has a high risk of fundamentally changing the quality of reliability service? Is our current regulatory construct set up to essentially say to utilities, why don't you come back when it's a problem? Why don't we have this conversation when reliability has eroded, and then we can look at it? And of course, no one's saying this on purpose, but if we don't be purposeful in the regulatory frameworks that we're establishing, that's the risk you run, is that you don't have those proactive investments or changes to business practices to prepare for the reliability needs of the future. You're still operating in the paradigm of the past, and that's going to lead to a situation where reliability only gets addressed when it's falling into poor territory.
And
Yeah.
if I could jump in, just
Please.
because you did mention that the draft clean electricity regulations, and so my introductory comments I talked a little bit about that, but from a public policy standpoint, particularly in Ottawa, as somebody who spends I spend the bulk of my time in Ottawa talking to policymakers. It is only very recently that the conversation, thankfully, has now shifted to include affordability and reliability. And there's a number of people, Dale, my friend and colleague from ATCO, we've been providing comment into the clean electricity regulations, but it really has been years where reliability and affordability have not been part of the public discourse in sort of political Ottawa. And so while we have concerns about the draft clean electricity regulations and are engaged in that, at least we have now got the conversation to include reliability at that point. And then just as a quick aside, just for the timer, I think there's something wrong with the timer because it says we're out of time. So just so we know what our time is here, it's our countdown clock is about.
I was going to bolt in 3 minutes.
I know. I got bad news for you. We got plenty more to talk about.
The advantage of having Francis on the panel, he decides what time it is. Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep an eye on these mics, and if I see people making their way up, I'll make sure to come over to the mics. But otherwise, what I might do is probe a little bit further on something, Brandon, that we were talking about in the preparation for this. You were talking about specifically trying to quantify the value of an outage, for example, and feeling like, you know, how do I assign a value for an hour of outage to residential customers versus industrial customers and commercial customers, and those weren't always necessarily being taken into the.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. I can very much appreciate for anyone having to assess the utility application that's sort of driving towards reliability as an outcome, thinking about costs that aren't on the bill.
Yeah.
Right. The purpose of economic regulation was to sort of control monopolistic tendencies, and it's very rate focused. It's very bill focused, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. But if reliability is going to be a priority, if we see material risks for that on the horizon, we might have to start thinking about a more comprehensive benefit cost analysis that looks at some of these other costs. And the good news is that that's ongoing. There are federal organizations that are looking at that. In Ontario, I think we should be a few weeks away from a final benefit cost assessment framework from the Ontario Energy Board. That's a big step in that direction, looking at both, at this point, I think they're just looking at the distribution service level, but they have an energy system test that's kind of a step up that will be a phase 2 to that. So I think that's really important work because it's very easy, especially if reliability is relatively good, or at least not bad enough to be terribly concerned about in the context of a regulatory application, to say, well, you know, this is a pretty big investment that's being proposed here, and how bad is reliability? And when you plug that in the context of what goes through the revenue requirement and hits the bill, it's all cost. There's no built-in benefit there. It's just all cost, and so it can be looked at as a discretionary investment, and you know, you're going to get a lot of scrutiny on that. But there is a benefit there, and it's an avoided cost. It's the avoided cost of outages. You know, it's one number for a residential customer, which isn't terribly large, but when you have 1 million residential customers, that adds up. It's a very different number for large industrial customers when you have a line shut down even for an hour. That's a lot of economic impact. And so the methodologies are there to do that. Just in my experience, it's not been something that's often brought forward, and when it is brought forward, it's like, well, I'm not really disagreeing with your analysis as we look at those benefit numbers, but is that really something we're going to weigh heavily? Because I'm interested in the bill, what's flowing through the revenue requirement hitting the bill. So as much as I can appreciate where that history comes from, if we're going to prioritize reliability, you need to give it its due, which is that it has economic benefits. And that's to say nothing of storm hardening, which, Tom, you could probably speak to better than I from your work on this paper.
I could. I'd just like to talk about the value of reliability. I mean, sometimes, as you said, the value is sort of hidden because it's sort of embedded in the bill.
Or it's a counterfactual. Or
yeah.
It is.
So
Yeah.
I mean, well, but I mean, where, you know, at least, I mean, my background is more on the wholesale market side. Like, you know, Winter Storm Elliott in MISO in one day was $350 million in congestion-related costs due to a storm. We want to avoid that, and that's just one day. You saw the events in Texas in the multi-billions of dollars. You've seen ridiculous sums of money in California show through the market. So these are very significant sums, often far outweigh, you know, some grid hardening investment that might, you know, would make a ton of sense. So I totally agree with Brandon. Like, let's find a way to have a sensible cost-benefit model to bring in those broader societal and economic and benefits associated with relatively small investments in network infrastructure. That's my contribution.
Yeah, something else I remember you raising also earlier, Tom, was that when we're trying to decide the value of reliability, maybe it's a bit much to expect interveners from the customer level to come forward with a dollar figure, but you said, who does know how much reliability is worth? It's the industrials.
Oh, yeah.
And if they take matters into their own hands, then that can mean a real loss in revenue also if they're all of a sudden ensuring their own reliability.
I actually think, sorry to jump in, but
Please.
I think that's actually could become an even bigger issue, is that customers are very aware, or increasingly aware, of their options. Industrials already have many options, commercials and increasingly residentials. And there's a lot of discussion around the bill impacts of the clean energy transition, but bills aren't going down anytime. They're not going down. They're going to go up. And so customers are going to be using electricity for far more use cases, whether it's transportation or heating and cooling. There's going to be a lot less tolerance for the inconvenience of a reliability event, and they'll have more options. So I think there's a longer term impact as well, is if a customer gets dinged by reliability events, at some point they're going to say, I'm actually going to do something else. I'm going to take matters into my own hand. And that's an outcome I don't think as an industry, we want to encourage. And I think that, more investment in reliability through the regulatory framework would help mitigate some of those longer term potential impacts.
Yeah, I think, oh, great, we have a question, please.
Thanks, Jen. I thought I'd kick off questions too, since everybody's shy. Just wanted to dig into this a little further, particularly on the drivers towards focus on reliability and I would say arguably like vicious customer service that the regulatory innovation in the UK that I sort of touched on is delivering, right? And there's a bunch of drivers behind that. Sort of a real simple one is, and Tom and I talked about this earlier, natural gas, right? Like natural gas, high risk in the UK. So it's not viable to provide reliability affordably through natural gas anymore. There's others. You were just alluding to some of them, customer usage, the services that they're demanding, all of those sorts of things. Do you see those drivers coming to Canada? Are they already here? Are they on their way? Is it too far off for us to care about? Like, where are we in that cycle? Part of the reason that the change has been much more rapid over there is because those drivers came faster, right? They're not coming at the same pace here. I believe they are coming. They might metastasize differently, but they're coming if they're not already here. So just some thoughts on that.
I can offer a few thoughts. Sure. I mean, one of the things for those that were able to join in for the full Camput session that I really enjoyed from Peter's speech kicking things off was he talked about this barbell investment, sort of a lot of investment on the front end, sort of upstream generation side, a lot of investment going on sort of the consumer end, and in the middle, not a ton of distribution and transmission investment from where he sits. And I found that fascinating. And when I think about drivers, particularly down at the distribution level, and what's coming to Canada, the dynamics and size of loads that would come about if we get even kind of close to the lofty goals that we have over the next 10 to 15 years for DERs and EVs completely changes the nature of the distribution grid. I don't know if I'd be right to say the vast majority, and Francis would know better than I, but certainly most of the systems that I work with are not ready for that at all. They're not built to do that. They have to make investments as a table stakes just to be able to facilitate those end uses, those new types of load. And so at that level, I certainly see those drivers coming, presuming that they do come along on the pace that we're largely anticipating. The good news in terms of reliability is at that level of the system, there's a lot of overlap in terms of how do we improve reliability, even in a status quo scenario, and how do we create a grid that is prepared to be reliable in that future scenario. Certainly fault location isolation service restoration, FLISR, is the one that always comes to mind for me. You can put that in place in grids today, and you're going to vastly reduce the impact of an outage by being able to isolate areas of your grid and keep customers online that otherwise would be knocked out in an outage situation. So right now, without a large proliferation of EVs or DERs or a DSO model impacting the system, you've got a benefit built in there from a reliability perspective, but also you've now built a system that is much better equipped to be able to handle those drivers as they start to come online and proliferate at the distribution level. And not to plug too hard for benefit cost assessments, but that's to me a very good example of how those can help sitting here today. Because sitting here today, most, I would probably say all, distribution networks aren't in a position to go to the regulator and say, hey, look, we've got so many EVs or DERs on our system that we actually can't manage it. That's not where we are today. But it takes time to do these investments. And in the interim, before those impacts hit the system and during that time that we need to make those investments to be ready, you can at least say to the regulator as a utility, so I'm doing this, and I'm doing this because I need to be in a future state and operate at a higher level. But in the meantime, I'm going to deliver a better product for my customers. I'm going to deliver more reliability, and here's the economic value of my industrials and even down to my residentials not losing load for a given hour.
I probably echo what Brandon said. I think in the UK, like, gas is now incredibly expensive, and there's the security risk of relying on Russian gas or wherever the source is. Therefore, the alternatives to develop the distribution as a potential replacement may be high risk, right? I mean, it may or may not work out, but there's more room to play with because the alternative is so costly and non-palatable. I don't think we're there in Canada. I think there's still a role for natural gas. It's cost competitive in many jurisdictions. We're not under the same sort of security of supply pressures. I think there'll be a lot to learn from Europe as they develop out those DSO models. I know in certain parts of Canada it's also being developed, and I think it's fantastic. I do think it is going to be the way of the future, but I think we have a bit more time in Canada. We also have a natural asset here. It makes sense to use it.
Yeah, we did do a test of a DSO model with the Smart Grid funded IESO and Electra non-wires alternative project in Ontario, and they were just discussing how they found that in terms of reliability from a T&D perspective, they said they come together. It's not, I think typically we think sort of a NERC status, like reliability is something you maintain at the bulk level, but they were saying when they had this DSO model, and it was your total DSO model for Electra, they found that if they were solving a problem that was showing up at the distribution level, coincident with a problem being recognized by the IESO, they were like, great, it solved both of our issues. But the only challenge they would run into is if there was a problem at the distribution level, and then right after there was a problem at the transmission level, and they wanted the same asset to serve both in sequence, that was where there was a challenge. So we're starting to see, like, how does reliability look from a whole system optimization kind of T&D level, and not just thinking about it, and isolated for transmission.
I work for the ISO. I was responsible for the wholesale markets, and I spent a lot of time with the control room. And I can tell you right now, there'll be no trust in relying on that model to solve your day-to-day reliability, operability challenges. It's not proven. Like, maybe in 10 years or 15 years, you could use 20% of your mix using distributed resources, but I think it would be personally foolhardy to say we're going to do that in the next 3 years when it's not. I think the pilots are fantastic. I think there's a ton of potential, but it's going to take time to demonstrate itself, and we have some time.
I'll disagree with you on 15 years, but I'll go to Joe.
Thanks. So in considering the challenge of reliability and as an extent the challenge of capital financing, flexibility for regulatory flexibility was a common theme in both on-bright and always on. But at the same time, there's also this recommendation for clarity and direction. So to some, maybe perhaps who are a bit cynical, they think flexibility means more customization, bespoke with the utility that leads to inefficiency, which might be a bit longer, a bit unclear. So I know we actually yesterday at Camputs, we were talking about that trade-off between clarity, something that's quick but more rigid, versus something that's a bit longer and more flexible. So does that trade-off actually exist? Is there a balance in there? What does that trade-off look like when we're considering that balance?
I have some views on this.
Go for it.
Good, because I'd like to know too.
Yeah, great. Yeah, all the answers can be yours, Francis. No, I think, to me, anyways, when I think about that trade-off, I don't think we want to look to elected government to prescribe too much, but I do think there are some big stakes in the ground that they need to place there. I know in conversations over the last few days, I've referenced Ontario's decision around nuclear as a point of example, right? And it is not just, I was really thrilled to see that decision from them last summer, not necessarily as an advocate for nuclear, though I have plenty of support for nuclear. I would have been just as happy if their decision was, we're not doing nuclear, but here's what we're doing instead. Because there are some directions that only government can set because they're big investments or they're long lead times or they're directional items, but they set them up here. And the beauty of the regulatory arena is that we're provided an opportunity, the space to review all of the evidence and find that balance. The title for this panel, I believe, was that trilemma of affordability, sustainability, reliability. I promise you all three of those dials are not set to 10 ever. Right, the balancing act is to be completed in the regulatory arena where we have all of that evidence and we can tailor the three of them in that context. And so, when policy direction is limited in scope but very clear in its kind of big ticket direction and decision, from there, I would argue regulatory flexibility is very much required. You have different circumstances across different utilities. It certainly varies from province to province, but even if you look within provinces, the circumstances of a Toronto hydro are going to be very different than the circumstances of North Bay hydro. And you need to afford them the opportunity to bring proposals out that respond to their specific needs, which are going to be different. And then the regulator has a tough job, which is to evaluate what can sometimes be disparate proposals from disparate entities, but they have the evidence and the space to do so, ideally.
Yeah, I think just being clear on the vision for the expectations, but then empowering the utilities through the framework to deliver on it and giving them room to maneuver is how I'd like to think of it.
Or, if we tie it to reliability, maybe by way of example, government can be the one to say reliability is a top priority. We want all of these other things and we're pursuing them, but reliability is paramount in that context. But then it is upon the, sort of the regulatory arena, as I would call it, to say, okay, well, what do we do with that? Do we need a special deferral or variance account for some particular type of investment for unexpected things? I'm certainly an advocate for more and more targeted incentives in some regulatory contexts. Is reliability something that is worthy of an incentive? These are things that I certainly wouldn't want to see elected government decree, but if they set a direction, then I'd like to think between utility proposals and regulator reviews, you've got all the tools to put those things in place and make that direction a reality.
Yep. I think if I'm reading this right, we have...
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't believe the clock anymore.
It's a trick.
I think we might have 5 minutes. I think we can go till 2, correct? So go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, so hi. On my way from Ottawa to Calgary on the plane, I studied the AESO's Reformed Energy Market recommendations to the Alberta government. And I thought it was really interesting. It also speaks to kind of the reliability risks that increasing shares of renewable generation on the grid present. And they offer a lot of new different market interventions to try to tweak the very simple market that's worked for a long time in Alberta, the energy-only real-time market, to kind of account for the challenges that renewables, which have come on the grid really quickly, present. And so they include things like location, they're thinking about locational price signals for transmission connections so that you're optimizing connections. They're thinking about rethinking cost causation principles so that renewable power plant producers do bear some of the cost of congested transmission lines rather than just the end-use customer. They talk about removing price floors in the market so that if there's too much supply, suppliers might be in a negative price situation. And they also propose changing the real-time market to a day-ahead market. And so that for me introduces, well, can a renewable power developer have the certainty that on a day-ahead basis, they will be able to provide and not face penalties for not offering their supply on the next day. So with all these interventions to fix reliability, I do wonder, are we going too far? Do we risk stifling renewables investment in Alberta with these types of interventions? And I guess in the conversation of reliability, whereas renewables do have negative externalities to some extent, and maybe you can correct me on there, with reliability, they also have very positive externalities, both of which don't have appropriate price signals. So we talk about decarbonization. So I wonder if you could speak to that a bit, and to what extent should, is this red alert, red alert, red alert, or is it a bit more nuanced? Like, could you elaborate on that?
Oh, I'm looking at you, Tom.
Yeah, okay. I'd love to talk more about this. This is very interesting. My view is that wholesale markets need to continually evolve in order to reflect what they're designed to do, in order to continue to add value. And that's the same for any market, whether it's in Texas or Alberta or Ontario or wherever it is. And they need to continue. So, you've seen a huge influx of renewable generation into Alberta. So that does introduce a new reliability challenge. But at the same time, Alberta relies on high energy prices for its resource adequacy investment to attract a lot of generation investment. So it's a bit of a catch-22, because there's lots of things you could do. You could expand the interties and maybe manage that risk across a bigger footprint, but you might suppress wholesale prices, which would... So I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I don't know the solution for Alberta, but there needs to be a way to have a dialogue to understand the pros and cons of these different reforms, to come to the right balance that makes sense for any individual marketplace. Historically, Alberta's relied very heavily on its energy-only market, but with the inclusion of a whole new different resource mix, does it make sense to think about how do we incent storage to manage those periods of excess? Does a day-ahead market help or discourage storage, for example? What about shortage pricing? Is that going to be a way that you could reform the energy market to make the value of scarcity more valuable? Limited intertie or large intertie investment, what implications? So there's many different solutions that could be developed, but I think, and what I do like about Alberta, it has a very active stakeholder engagement process that is volatile at times, but I'm pretty confident that Alberta will come to a good solution that makes sense for Alberta. I'm not sure I gave you a specific answer, but gave you my perspectives.
I think it's interesting to see. I think a lot of what you were reinforcing in Bonbright, Brandon, the difference between policy getting more specific on the what, but making sure that you allow the regulators to get into the how, and not to have the policy get into the how. So maybe, Francis, just to make sure that you get an opportunity to kind of reflect on this from what you're hearing from your members, are you feeling like there's a good amount of the how that's being brought forward, that's less of the barrier, it's more the what, or are you finding like it's a little of each that members tend to be?
Well, I think it is both.
Yeah.
It isn't a matter of this will be fixed solely if we focus on the legislative frameworks under which regulators operate, nor can this be fixed if we focus solely on the actual work of within the regulatory community. We're going to have to address both sides to be able to get this right.
Yeah, I think that brings us about to time. Are we? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much to the panel for joining us. Again, you have a copy of the report that was released this year on your tables, and you can download it the way that Francis mentioned. But also be sure to go to the Electricity Canada website and find last year's Back to Bonbright. Bonbright is still relevant this year. So thank you very much to our panel and for your questions.
Thank you.